so wonderful to see so many people on Zoom. Wow, that's pretty impressive. And I'm as nervous as I am as excited to talk about deep brain stimulation, but I'm really glad to see that that Keith and Lynn Jolly are on board here this morning, because I think whatever I know about DBS has probably come from them. So yahoo. I'm going to just try to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm really also glad that Rebecca and Vince and Celia are on board, and Nina. Okay, so can you see that now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it the whole screen, or is it, how are we going?
Doesn't it pinch out?
Sorry?
Doesn't it's a pinch out?
It's a pinch out, is it? What do I do, Mirelle?
Have you got it expanded to full screen?
I'll just put it in from beginning. How's that? Hang on.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, so yes, so I'm Rachel. I'm the Parkinson's nurse. I've been up in Port Macquarie or the Hastings Macleay since about 2018. My husband always laughs at where we are. We're in Port Macquarie, but he says that I travel north to Southwest Rocks, and I travel south to North Haven and West Haven and Laurelton and Kew. There's quite a big area, but he's always wondering whether we're going to end up with and also north to West Kempsey. So it does get a bit confusing about where I'm going, but it's a big area, and I've met quite a few people. I have known since I've been here that we've probably got about 13, probably a few more people that have actually got deep brain stimulation. So I'd come from St Vincent's Hospital, where I had been looking after people post-operatively with DBS, but never probably in a support role, you know, beyond when they left hospital. It's always usually up to the role of the neurologist where I was. And what I have discovered, as everybody knows in Port Macquarie, how much I love belted Galway cows. So my GPS took me to a paddock one day instead of to someone's house, and this is when I discovered these wonderful cows. I also have a disclaimer. I am a learner when it comes to deep brain stimulation, and again I just reiterate that what I have learnt has really been through the patients that I've met that have got DBS, and it's been an interesting time because we know that it's a very metropolitan centred service, and I guess given COVID and some of the issues about travelling, we've tried to look at ways probably in Port Macquarie where we can support people locally with their deep brain stimulation a little bit more. The other person that I really am absolutely indebted to was having spent a day with Emma Everingham, who's one of the nurse practitioners at Westmead. I think Rebecca's also been down there too, so I got to spend a day in the clinic actually observing her caring for people with deep brain stimulation, and then the next day I spent a day with Neil Mahant and Brian Owler with two patients actually having DBS, and I have to say I had a newfound respect for the neurosurgeons and the neurologists, and also the Medtronic technicians, which is Anna Grace Fleming, who I've had a lot to do with as well. That was pretty impressive, and I was very, very, very honoured and appreciative to have been involved in that day. And also there was a couple of patients that were actually having just their neurostimulator batteries changed. So really very, very valuable day for someone who was still on their L plates. I've got a couple of questions. I guess you can just thumbs up. Is deep brain stimulation a cure for Parkinson's disease? Up or down?
Down.
Down. Okay, so it's not a cure, as we know. You know, with the device-assisted therapies, these device-assisted therapies are really to help people who are down the track. I believe that is it Paul Silverstein did a talk recently, and he talked about how patients end up deciding between some of these device-assisted therapies. So we know it's not a cure, but it's certainly to help ameliorate some of the advanced symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And secondly, can you stop taking your medications once you've got DBS?
No.
Up or down?
Down.
No. So most patients, Most patients still continue to take some medications. So while you have deep brain stimulation, unfortunately, the disease still progresses, and we still probably need to keep giving people their medications. But certainly, I sort of see it like as anyone's parachuted out of the plane, and you think that once you've parachuted and put your chute up, someone's going back up. It's actually the other people accelerating forward. So it certainly plateaus out some of the symptoms. I will leave it to the absolute experts to say who's suitable for deep brain stimulation. But I noticed more and more of the discussions at some of the conferences and with neurologists is that people who are suitable for any device-assisted therapy, that the decision is actually really encouraged for the patient to choose. So there is sort of an inclusion-exclusion criteria, and I'm not going to go into it great depth, but you know, someone that's had 4 years disease duration, of course, these things will vary from centre to centre. Someone with 4 months or greater of motor complications, which is described as on time, which might be characterised by the disabling dyskinesias. So the uncontrollable movements that are usually the side effect of levodopa, or off time. So where people's symptoms re-emerge because they're not actually absorbing medications or their oral tablets as well. So that might result in these disabling tremors, rigidity, slowness, or the unpredictable on and off motor fluctuations. So, a patient that two patients that I'm actually looking at after at the moment, they've got fairly unpredictable on and off motor fluctuations, and they're being worked up for deep brain stimulation. So they'll take their tablets. One man takes his Stalevo at 8:30, at 9 o'clock, nothing's happening, 9:30, nothing happening. And then, a couple of hours later, he's actually taken his second Stalevo, and then he's got these, dyskinesias. So he's actually on a bridging therapy of apomorphine in preparation for deep brain stimulation. And then, of course, the medication-resistant tremors. As we know, some tremors just are very difficult to respond to levodopa. Does that all make sense? And am I talking too quickly? Because I tend to talk very quickly. Everything okay, Morel? Okay. So deep brain stimulation. So, sorry. Okay. Okay, so we know that with DBS, and I'm going to talk about deep brain stimulation specifically for Parkinson's disease. I know we know that it's actually being used for a lot of other, body movement dystonic reasons, but this really about DBS for Parkinson's. So it's got 3 components. It has the electrodes that typically go into the subthalamic nucleus, which is where the substantia nigra is, where the loss of those neurons, and it's around the area of the basal ganglia, which also controls movement. And then it's attached to the leads. It's usually bilateral, left and right, and then it attaches to the leads. And then this comes down to this, either the battery or the neurostimulator, or the, what do they call it, implantable, I forgot the name of it already. Where's Keith and Lynn?
Pulse check.
Anyway, down into the battery, okay? And I guess, it's a bit of a crash course in actually how it works, and I don't really fully understand it, but we know that the battery delivers a current, and that's measured in voltage and pulse width, which is your hertz. And then there's also this, when you have your DBS check, we check for impedance too. So my husband very kindly tried to explain it to me. If it's like a hose that delivers water, the voltage is the pressure, the pulse width is the width of the hose, and maybe there's sand in the hose, which causes this resistance or impedance. And that's how we measure these things. Okay, and so in the surgery, as we know, patients have their electrodes inserted, and they've got the neurosurgeons doing that, and the neurologist is actually looking for that point in the patient's brain where there's abnormal activity that's causing these symptoms of Parkinson's, and they usually can sense it and hit the right spot. And then each of these electrodes has contact points. And the point about that is that there's lots of ways to adjust the DBS. Everybody with me still?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Cool. It was interesting the other day, somebody said to me that they thought that there was just Westmead doing these procedures, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows, and you can tell me if there's more, but as far as I'm aware, the DBS Centres in New South Wales are at North Shore Private with Dr. Ray Cook and Dr. Paul Silberstein, and I noticed on their website recently that they've actually hit the 500 mark. So I think over 14 years, they've actually provided implants for 500 patients, which is really amazing. There's BrianOwler and Neil Mahant at Westmead in the public and the private, and also the other neurosurgeon is Jackie McMaster. Emma tells me that she can tell the difference between the neurosurgeons by the way they do their insertion for the electrodes. At St Vincent's, we have Ben Yonker, who is a neurosurgeon, and Dr. Stephen Tish, and they operate in the private and the public as well. Rebecca, I know who's up in Tweed. She probably looks up into Queensland where places are actually offering. Is there anybody that knows anywhere else that I may have missed? No? Okay. So I guess the other reason why I became quite interested in wanting to understand more about DBS was that we did have an IMS, which is an incident management reporting, when I first arrived here. I want to say that I was actually in Japan on our conference in 2019, Morel, I think, when this happened. So that means it absolves me of what went wrong. But what did happen was we had a lady locally, and she had a fall and she injured her shoulder, and she had to go to surgery. And there's probably not a lot of policy and procedure around patients going into regional hospitals like Port Macquarie about what we have to do with deep brain stimulation. So her husband very wisely turned off her DBS to have her shoulder. She had a open reduction internal fixation, so she had a lot of hardware. She came back to the ward, and for the next couple of days she seemed to be okay, but things started to deteriorate, and he couldn't work out what was going on. No one really could either. I think it was probably by day 5 he had a brain spark or a light globe moment where he realised that her problem was that her therapy hadn't been turned back on. So I guess out of everything that's unfortunate that happens, we learn a lot. So we put in an IMS report, and then I was actually able to go and speak with the anaesthetists here in Port Macquarie and talk about how we could avoid that situation in the future. And so we're looking about getting some policies in place. On the back of that, we had a couple of face-to-face meetings, which was wonderful. The first one started at the very beginning of COVID in 2020. I reckon if we're planning to have a DBS user group, there's going to be another pandemic happening, because then we had to put them off for such a long time. We got together again at the beginning of this year, and bang, we can't have them again. We were due to have it on the 21st of July. And we're very fortunate because Anna Grace from Medtronic, I think most patients up here have the Medtronic device. She was going to come back and try and explain some things to patients about the use of their therapy and how to maximise understanding and knowing about it. But what we did do was distribute some contact lists between each of the members, and they were very grateful about that. There's been some issues about patients recharging therapy not working really well, and they wanted to know who they could call if they needed to, to loan out their recharging devices. The other thing that we did, and that was probably back on the IMS, was that I definitely went through all the patients that I knew, and I updated their electronic medical record with a DBS alert. And it was about the type of device they had, the date of insertion, who their neurologist and neurosurgeon was, and who they could call for a toll-free number if they needed to. And this is what it looks like a little bit. So when we, I think most of the state now, but correct me if I'm wrong, most of the state uses this Cerner product for our medical records. So the first thing that happens when a doctor or a clinician accesses the patient's record, it comes up with an active specific medical condition that they need to look at and see what it is. And they meant to click on, and then they go to a special section which says alerts, problems and diagnoses. It's all written up there. And here you can see I've entered in that the patient has a deep brain stimulation. Oh, bad spelling. Whoopsie, better check that. They've got a Medtronic Activa RC. So I know that's a rechargeable device. This is the serial number, the model number, and the date it was implanted, and where that actual battery or the neurostimulator is. So it's usually under the right chest, although I did have one lady which had her stimulator inserted much lower. Known to Dr. Silverstein and Ray Cook at North Shore Private. If you have to speak to them about whether the patient's suitable for MRI eligibility or pre or post-surgical management, if you can't get a hold of them, call the toll-free Medtronic number. So slowly we've been putting that in so to alert the doctors and the nurses that this is what it is, because I think Brian, Keith and Lynn will know that they normally think that this is actually a pacemaker for someone's heart, and that happens quite a lot. So what we did at the support group discussions was, I think there was a lot of discussion about the wheres and wherefores of how you recharge your neurostimulator battery. What happens if you do need an MRI? What happens when you go to theatre? And then one of the patients brought in a letter and said, what do all these settings mean and why is it important to me? So that's sort of probably what we'll talk about now. And I'm just going to refer to the Medtronic devices. There is two other, there's St Jude and Boston Scientific that also provide the hardware for deep brain stimulation, but my knowledge is fairly much centred around Medtronic. So we know that there's two types of the neurostimulator batteries. One is a rechargeable battery, and the advantage of that is it can last up to 15 years. And I think at the last meeting, Anna Grace mentioned that the warranties have been extended to 10 years. And then there's the non-rechargeable battery, which usually lasts for about 3 years. So you can see there's definite advantages or disadvantages. I'm gathering, and if anyone wants to correct that, well, actually we did have one gentleman that had the rechargeable battery, and he just seemed to spend forever recharging, and then he'd inadvertently turn off his therapy, and it all became a little bit too hard. So we actually sent him back down to St Vincent's, and he went back to the non-rechargeable battery. When patients arrive in ED, there's a lot of discussion about what are we meant to do, how are we meant to recharge them. And there's actually a wonderful video on YouTube, which I've put the link in here, and it goes to the Medtronic site. And it's such a controlled and wonderful environment where people actually spend time to recharge the battery. So that's been a lot of the discussions at the group. I just might go. So the questions were, people talked about how often they had to recharge, how long did it take them, and then I put this classic line in here, did you know that you can recharge your recharger? Because recently we had a patient who came from North Shore, new DBS, and he was actually, he hadn't recharged his recharger, if that makes sense. So I think I've got it in here. He was actually plugging his recharging device into the AC, and of course when we had the awful floods in early this year, he lost power, and then so he couldn't actually recharge his device, and so he came into Port Macquarie Base Hospital. He was absolutely frozen because he was completely off, and so we spent time recharging. But what he didn't understand was that he could actually recharge his recharger. People said, how long does it take you? One lady says, well, I'm happy to recharge my device, you know, for 30 minutes every day. Someone said, well, I prefer to wait for 10 days and spend 4 hours to recharge. Some people said that they, you know, happy to watch TV, or they'll do different things when they're recharging. So that was a good discussion for everyone to have, and to compare notes about how they actually recharge their rechargers, and also about recharging their battery. So we know too, most people have the patient stimulator, which you can see here. I was really amazed if Vince is on, when we went to the recent Introduction to Neurological Nursing, and Vince brought along one of his DBS patients, and they've got a newer device which looks like a Samsung, I think it's a Samsung telephone with an app on it, and that actually allows them to recharge and check their parameters. So if anybody knows which is the most terrible button you should never touch on checking the battery, it's this. This is the therapy button. So this actually turns the therapy on and off. And this is what this poor gentleman kept doing. He'd recharge for hours, then he'd check his battery and he'd inadvertently turn his actual therapy off. So checking the battery, you know, from ranging that the battery looks fantastic down to this other error message which says ERI, elective replacement indicator, which means that you've probably got about a year before your battery needs replacing. And this is the newer technology that we've been told about. This is a new Percept device. All I know is that it has some advanced functionality, and it uses this SungSat app on a phone to check battery and parameters. Mirelle, do you want some discussion with everybody, or are you happy for me to keep going?
How many more slides have you got to go?
Not many more.
Yeah, no, let's keep going and then.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So the question is, people say to me, why can't I have an MRI? Well, so an MRI is actually magnetic resonance imaging. Okay, it's a fantastic, absolutely gold standard modality for tests. It has a large magnet and radio waves in a computer. So, and it gives us these, you know, these cross-sectional images of internal structures and organs. So you can imagine if you've got an electric current flowing through electrodes and into contact points, that could pose a bit of a problem. And if you have ever had to have an MRI, you'd know that you've actually got to, remove any kind of jewelry. We worry about any kind of devices, and but then someone said to me, but exactly what does it do? So essentially what happens if you had DBS, it heats the electrode tips. Can you imagine what that would do? Probably a bit of brain, tissue damage. It can induce currents or change the currents. It can cause that pulse generator dysfunction and mechanical forces. Is that enough to scare you at all? Yep, probably is. So we also know though that patients can be assessed for MRI eligibility. And so again, I'm just talking about the Medtronic device. So can I show you here? I carry this form around with me wherever I go, and then call back to the neurologist to find out, what we could do if the patient absolutely, definitely needs an MRI. So a recent example was a man with DBS. He had a really awful knee and he's been waiting to get an MRI, and he was worried about his eligibility. So we checked it. I went up to the hospital and spoke to IMED, and they have this machine, which is a 1.5 Tesla, which is about the magnetic force, and that would be agreeable if the neurologist then helped me put him into a different mode and he could actually have that scan, as opposed to a 3 Tesla MRI scanner. The problem too is that on Medicare benefits, he wouldn't be able to get a benefit for it. He would have to pay, and it was going to be about $300 or $400. And I said to him, well, probably for the cost of traveling to Sydney, you might be better off, paying it and see how you go. So other tests though, people say, what about CAT scans, DAT scans, X-rays, fluoroscopy, PET scans, and so on? I think they're all safe with people with DBS, but I always recommend that they let the neurologist know that they're going to go for those tests, particularly with ultrasound. They may need to make some changes, and also to let the person that's actually doing the test that you have DBS and that you've been, suitably assessed for risk. Same with having an operation. So what is the problem? If they're using surgical diathermy, I was telling my husband this last night, he said, what in the heck is surgical diathermy? So essentially it's heat cauterization. So when surgeons do their operations, they use a scalpel, but they also use this heat device to close off bleeding and vessels and so on. So, and the problem is, again, it's heat, so it can cause a temporary suppression of this neurostimulator reprogramming. So that's why it's important to have those big chats with the anaesthetist. The actual surgeons can change some of the diathermy settings to make it safer for the patient with DBS. Just finally, one of the discussions at the group was, heck, what does my report mean? I've got a group B. this is my settings for my left subthalamic nucleus and my right, and what do all these things mean? And we could go drill down, and I'll probably get Emma or Emma Everingham or Anna Grace. But I guess essentially what I've discovered, which is really, really, really cool, is that when there's so many different parameters that the neurologists can set for people with DBS. And so what they do is they're taking a clinical history and working out the symptoms that are still bothering people, and they change the voltage and possibly the pulse width to address those symptoms. And the classic example is, I can't actually show you, but what we did discover from one of the recent meetings with Anna Grace was that instead of calling it Group B or Group A, the patients can actually call it for talking or for walking. So in some cases, if they're increasing the voltage on someone, it may help their tremor, but it actually may slur their speech. And so the idea would be that in a different group setting, they could put down the voltage and adjust the hertz that their speech was actually better. So I'm really keen on our patients now to start really documenting what the group is actually targeting in terms of the patient's symptoms, so that we know, that Group B works really well for addressing a certain bunch of symptoms, and maybe Group A, if it's been set up, targets another bunch of symptoms. And also very keen to change it. So Anna, Grace and Emma have actually given me the clinician program, and I'm telling that as a little bit of a boast, because we've actually had quite a few patients now who have trusted me to actually change their settings with the advice of the neurologist using telehealth, and watching them here, so that's number one, didn't have to go to Sydney, which is fantastic. And I also could explain to them, the reasons that we were changing it. So nerve-wracking, but exciting. So always a bit of a daredevil when it comes to things like that. So I never leave home without my Activa patient programming quick guide. And now there's lots of guides as well too on looking after your devices, and so many links on the internet. So that's my knowledge of Parkinson's. I was going to say, the other thing that I really discovered I'd like to is the spangled drongo, as well as the belt of Galway, since I've been here. But I think the fires blew the spangled drongo away.